It's just wonderful to have you both here this evening. We're super excited about this discussion on link rot, because if I could think of two people in the whole world that could come along this evening and talk about this subject with passion, enthusiasm, and also explainability, it's just the two of you are here. So without much further ado, I'm going to pass the floor to Brewster with your slides, and then we'll go to Jonathan. There'll be plenty of chat in the chat, and I will facilitate some of that, but I just think we've only got an hour. There's so much to talk about. I'll hand over to Brewster first, if that's okay. Thanks,
yeah, Catherine. Thank you very much. That's, it's hard to say that link rot is my favorite subject in the world, but it's pretty close. Is this showing? Can you see my screen?
Yeah, can see it.
Okay. So let's fight link rot, right? And let's understand what it is, and let's fight it. But I'd say it's all within a context of let's turn all the references blue. Let's go and make that dream of the web, the hypertext system, to come true. So that's the that's the idea. So link rot, what is it? It's when good girls go bad. So you used to be able to go and link to this nice White House page, and presto, some change happens, and you can't get to it anymore. Also, there's just content drift. So you basically think that it's going to be saying something, and then it says something else really soon thereafter. So how do you go and be able to lock down to go and say what it is you were interested? That's another form of link rot. Why link rot? Often I would say paywalls. So that's a different really way of viewing link rot, is you can't get to it. And I love this this title from Current Affairs of their cover issue is "The Truth is Paywalled, but the Lies Are Free," which indicates other problems than just technical things going on out there. But I think that is a fascinating way of sort of viewing link rot, of not being able to help people dive in and understand what's going on. Another is government restrictions. So the Great Firewall of China. There's lots of websites that are blocked in China, including the Internet Archive, but there's other countries that sort of turn these on and off. And different countries have, their verboten subjects, and those change over time. So how do we go and make it so that people can understand what references we're really referring to at different times? There's other issues coming up. So I wanted to say a little bit of what the Internet Archive has been doing to try to help Wikipedia. Just in 2016, we talked with the head of Wikipedia, and she was worried. And so we dove in to really try to help reinforce Wikipedia how we could. And one was to go and try to put in archived web links, and also to go and fix broken links in Wikipedia. So we've added more than 25 million archived links, many of which are to, if you were to go to our live link, they are no longer what the author was referring to. So that's a lot, which we're pretty excited about, and it's taken this long, 4 years, 5 years to do this with a dedicated team to just try to help Wikipedia alone. But the wonderful thing about Wikipedia is it's fixable after the fact. We're working with lots of Wikipedia editions, and basically there's links to the Internet Archive in the references section and external links, and we take snapshots whenever the Wikipedia pages change to make sure we have what the author was intending. And if you link, they will come. So this is a study of the clicks of users of Wikipedia, of where do they go when they leave Wikipedia. And the number one was web.archive.org, which is the Wayback Machine. And then next is books, and then DOI.org, which is periodicals, New York Times, on and on. So we're really thrilled that there are a lot of people coming and using these resources that take a lot of time and effort to go and put together, but it is working. We've with the 404 service, we really wanted the browsers to go and build in a 404 service into them. Brave has done that natively, and there are plugins for all the rest of the big browsers. So please use that. It's very helpful because even just this morning, I go to a web page and it's gone. And so it probes the Wayback machine and says, here it is. And it basically is just trying to make the web work kind of the way it should have worked originally. But we're just trying to patch and fix the current web. But let's go more broadly. What we really want is all the references to be able to be linked to smoothly and easily, so that you can go and take those footnotes that you never thought you had time to go and deal with, and then go and dive in and go down rabbit holes and at least go and find out whether the person that wrote that thing really had backup by going and referring to something they're citing. So how do you go and help that? Well, it's not a new idea. Vannevar Bush's Memex, which is an excellent paper. Boy, do I recommend you go and read As We May Think. I did a close reading of it just a year or so ago, and he's still, it is still illuminating, not just and this sort of funny microfilm-based machine that he drew, but all the way up through some of the telepathy things that are going on now in computers. Anyway, Memex, the idea is to link all resources. Project Xanadu of Ted Nelson was very explicit about having links between things, between versions, between where things came from, compound documents, transclusion. All of it is link-based and better than what we have with web-based linking. It's more like GitHub. So we're still short of some of the dreams of some of the greats that have come before us. So we wanted to turn all the book citations blue in Wikipedia. So first you have to go and find them, and then go and see if you can then link them to the right page. So this has got all sorts of technical issues, but it's also got a lot of other policy type issues. Why is this difficult? Really, it's licenses, closed content, copyright, access restrictions, institutional walls, really not seeing the bigger picture. So how do we kind of go about this? Another difficult issue is digitizing into the open is hard and expensive and unfortunately very uncommon. So when people do digitize, often they make it closed subscription services just for themselves or for their buddies or their paying subscribers. And it makes it so that we're not building a literature that's interlinked, particularly we're just building access portals, which is too bad. So going and digitizing in the open, and then there's the technology to make the links, which actually, as Jim Gray said, may all your problems be technical. So that's actually the relatively easy one compared to the other things that are institutional problems, for profits and nonprofits that are going on. So the way I think we solve that is to have active libraries that have to serve the world mandate as opposed to just serve their constituents or their subscribers. Better World Books is a B Corp, now owned by a nonprofit, and they've been donating millions of books to the project to try to get it so that we have not just the Wikipedia books, but all the books that would be in curriculum and commonly held in libraries. They're donating millions of books. Those are getting digitized by the Internet Archive. We're weaving these links into Wikipedia to go and make these citations live and real, to basically make latent hypertext links real. I think of them as link rot in the sense that they should be links, and now we're trying to make them into links. So we're moving along. We've now put in 1 million links to 250,000 books across 50 different Wikipedia language editions, and we're just getting started. So that's going along well. And of course, this is just Wikipedia, not all the other links that are out there. So now let's get everything linked and permanently. How do we do that? Well, let's start to get kind of an idea of the problem. So Active Measures is a book that had lots and lots of URLs in there, but they weren't linkable, and from going and using a from your book reader. So they don't even think about linking out from a lot of these book readers. So we collect things up and we then try to move them back into the EPUBs if the publishers will allow it. Silicon Valley Values is another. The recent Kindle book, and none of the URLs were clickable, even if they were URLs, and then they, not only that, they weren't then backed up automatically, which they should be. But there's some progress. There's a recent Kindle book where all of the URLs were linkable, and so that's good. And then that makes it a lot easier for us to go and try to make those permanent if we can get to people when things are starting to go wrong. And as I think we'll hear from Jonathan Zittrain, things do go wrong with links that are in documents. So we also have taken things like the Mueller report and worked very hard to try to go and find what it's all referencing to and then link those. And that was a project of the DPLA, and it took months, actually man-months, to go and try to get these materials linked to try to figure out what were they referring to. A lot of them were already on the web, but a lot of them not, so we have to go and digitize them, and that's a big part of the link rot problem, I would say, is going and digitizing and making things available. Then we want to basically go and link to books that were talked about in the television news archive and trying to get that type of thing. So here's a book referred to by President Trump when he was president, and here's the book that was being referenced about Donald Trump as the environmental hero. And so that you could go and follow up and see whether you think that was right or not. Upcoming for us, there's open syllabi, so people that go and make their syllabuses available, we would like to link all syllabi to living documents that they can get from their library or our library, or borrow things or through interlibrary loan, or know how to buy them from wherever else, but basically try to link syllabi. Upcoming also is link into our digitized books so that all of the references in the back of the book, so that you can have augmented book readers that would go and not have latent links. They would have real links that you can go and get to things. And we're starting to link to papers by going and archiving as many papers as we can into the Wayback machine. And we have Internet Archive Scholar. Please try it, scholar.archive.org. It's new. We're looking for feedback. It's not a replacement for Google Scholar, but in fact, we are now going and taking the papers that we have archived in the Wayback machine and surfacing those through Google Scholar. First 20 million of those, I think, have already gone in, which is kind of excellent. So the idea is to just try to make it so the scholarly record is more available, and starting to get to serials, the 20th century, by massive digitization, and try to make it so that those footnotes also become live and not just be rotted links. So thank you to a large number of people that are already working on these projects at the Internet Archive and other cooperating organizations. And it takes hundreds of libraries to source all the books. It takes hundreds of libraries to do all the web pages. And that's it for me. So link rot, I think we can conquer this thing, but we have to work with a sort of global focus in the same sense that Creative Commons and this global summit is all about.
Thank you so much, Brewster, for that. That was a tour de force, and I think the quote you used, "The truth is paywall, but the lies are free," is going to stick with me. Jonathan, over to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and hello, everybody. And it's hard to just say thank you, Brewster, in the sense that it's really hard for me to think of a single person and a single organization that has done more to represent the values of longevity and access to information and of generosity of spirit than Brewster and the Internet Archive. Creative Commons certainly gives them a run for their nonprofit money, but in fact, having CC and IA together is quite it's so interesting. Isn't CCIA like some industry trade association? Better have to come up with a different anagram. But having the two organizations together is just sort of the best of what this generative ecosystem that we're all so privileged to be a part of and to have a chance to contribute to the best of what it can offer. And so my thoughts today are really a way of kind of uttering a harmony to what Brewster just laid out. The way in some ways that PERMA, which is a service inspired by Brewster, the IA, and Mark Graham's work, kind of inspired, is a harmony to the Internet Archive. And it's worth even noting up front that Brewster and company had the insight to make the Internet Archive not have to choose between being a wholesale and a retail organization, which is to say it has public-facing access and presentation, both on lodging stuff within the archive and with being able to access stuff. It's got that kind of customer service window for the world at large, which I take to be kind of fundamental to its orientation. But it's also wholesale. There was a time when, as we were starting up PERMA and trying to figure out, okay, we're going to store a bunch of links and we're going to try to store them mumble forever, which is quite a commitment. And where are we going to get the storage for? Is it Amazon glacial storage? Or are we just going to start piling up hard drives quietly in the basement of the Harvard Law School library? And in talking with Brewster, he's like, oh yeah, well, just tell us what you need. You can put it at IA. And it's that kind of sense of wholesale relationship that has allowed multiple different variations and harmonizations off the IA theme to flourish in the space. And it's not just us doing it. It's people like Herbert Wandesample and Robustify and other services that are able to interact in a wholesale way towards kind of fundamental compatibility, so that back on the retail side, you can have somebody say, does anybody have a link? Kind of like, is there a doctor in the house? You mean, like, I'm looking for a link, and you've got a meta layer on top of it that says, yeah, IA has it in these 3 timestamps, and from these sources, PERMA has it over here, and TBD has it here, there, and everywhere. There's another thing that's special, I think, that's worth noting kind of for the ages and on the record in this session, which is I take the spirit of the Internet Archive and Brewster's attitude to be pre-Nike motto of just do it. And that doesn't just mean from an engineering perspective. It says build it and don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. Let's not like spend 8 weeks designing the logo for the thing before we like try to put up an alpha of it, but rather also with respect to societal and legal risk. Because let's be clear, certainly at the time of the Wayback machine getting going, there were seminars. You could get continuing legal education credit for seminars about whether linking and framing of sites would amount to a copyright infringement if done without prior permission, much less making a capture of all of them. And I took, and I'm just put this in my words, so I don't want to speak for Brewster, but I took the attitude of the Internet Archive to be do it, make clear the public interest in doing it, and bend but don't break to the extent that there is pushback. If somebody wants to say, that needs to go down, fine, we'll come up with a robots.txt or other protocol to say that will be darchived. That may not be retail available for the sake of the greater good. But we're not just going to wait for some moment that might never come of some grand blessing from the authorities that this is something to do. And that's in part because the Internet Archive can be both as official and infrastructural as it surely is, and it's just some organization, it's just a nonprofit. Hey, it's just us, which is very different, as we were starting PERMA, for example, of running the traps within a major university that has an endowment and doesn't want to lose it to statutory damages and a copyright infringement lawsuit, to appropriately run the traps and say, we're going to do this. And it's just so great to see the counterpart to the move fast and break things mentality of the .com startup world that says, oh yeah, there are like taxi cab regulations, whatever, Uber, enjoy. To see that kind of, we'll do it, and if it doesn't work, we go bankrupt and we start again, and it's not up to us to worry about the societal implications. To see that reinterpreted on the .org side, the library side, to say, we're going to do this, and we're going to do it with confidence, and we're going to explain why we're doing it. And you know what? If we do it right, nobody's going to try to take us down. And I just, that is a form of bravery and confidence that if you didn't have organizations that were counterparts to the grand legacy organizations, the libraries that with pride recount how many hundreds of years they've been around, you wouldn't have established now the practice that it's okay to do all of the stuff we're doing. And that's why I look with I'm moved when I hear of the millions of links and the pages and the work that represents that have been stored for the ages. You know, a million here, a million there. Pretty soon it's real information you're capturing for whoever comes after us. I can say just a little bit about the extent of link rot to just pull out the biggest statistics from some of the studies I've had luck to be part of, and it builds on top of a number of other studies. And if you look at ours, which I can put the link to in the chat room, you'll see some of the other work upon which we build by a number of other scholars. But we had originally done a study in 2014 and found that for Supreme Court opinions, half of all the links in Supreme Court opinions from 1789 to the present, I mean, really 1995 to the present, don't work. And 3/4 of the links in the Harvard Law Review, a distinguished legal journal, don't work. And when a legal opinion is citing to something, it's incorporating that into the law. It's saying to understand the law, you've got to understand what we're pointing to. And if what they're pointing to isn't there, or even worse, you don't just have a rot problem, you have a drift problem. It says something different than what the justice or their clerk saw when they put that link in. Then the flexibility of the web, that it's reference-based and you can change and update the reference, becomes a huge problem, as happened with at least one link in a Supreme Court opinion where the destination of the link went up for sale. Somebody bought it and put a snarky comment about Justice Alito in the link that Justice Alito links to that had formerly been to something else. So let me just address a few forward-looking issues that I think make this a particularly challenging time. One is the idea that when we think of archiving, the basic unit of it, the hydrogen element out of which we build a lot of other elements, is the URL. It's a Uniform Resource Locator. And the URL is not itself as a form to be taken for granted forever. More and more of the knowledge we store, that we share, and that we access is maybe not with a URL attached to it because it's inside an app. We're taking a screen snapshot if we want to try to save it for later, at which point, all right, how and where do I archive that? How do I tell somebody, this is what I'm looking at, have a look at it, the way that a URL lets you do? And even with the diminishment of the URL overall, there's also the idea that a U is uniform, which one aspect of that is what you see at the URL matches what I see at the URL. So you can say, this is what was at the URL. But in an era of personalization, what I see at my URL, even if it's identical to the one I just passed you, turns out to be totally different than what you see, at which point the architecture of centrally sourced archiving, send out the bots, send them everywhere. I think of like crows emanating from Old Town in Game of Thrones to give word that winter is coming. You can't do that because you're just seeing the world that's being built for you Truman Show style and for your crows, which might be different than what everybody else sees, which means that there might be a complement to the technique of centrally orchestrated and inspired to be shared with everyone archiving, which is people archiving as they go for their purposes so that others can see exactly the world as they saw it and are relying upon it, and maybe even to reveal that what we thought was the same thing was in fact quite different. And in spirit, there are projects like this. I think it's ProPublica that has been, and NYU folks offering people a plugin so that when they're on Facebook, their ads get scraped and archived automatically, and we can compare notes at last to see who's getting pushed what ads and for what purpose. That you just, without the help of Facebook users themselves, there'd be no easy way to do that. Now, another big issue ahead is one in the technical sense of integrity. In its simplest form, it means that what was put down is what you are seeing, and it hasn't been meddled with or altered in the meantime. The integrity remains. It remains unified. That is in question in part because of the malleability of the digital world. It's true for web pages. That's content drift is in some ways an integrity problem. You have an integrity question with archives themselves, that the archives once made do not get altered. And there have been really interesting strides on that front, such as the LOCKSS project, lots of copies keeps stuff safe, so that multiple archives with different custodians, ideally in different jurisdictions, can at t=0 have mitosis for the thing they're trying to save. They each get a copy, and then every so often they compare hashes and notes to see if anybody's copy has changed out from under them. Oh, your souffle fell, mine is still standing. I can tell you the height of the souffle that we all had when we first had it. I don't know why I just came up with that metaphor. I must be hungry, but that's a way of ensuring the way that by default traditional libraries did, because we each had a copy of a book, and that book wasn't likely to change unless somebody came in and tore out a page. We're in a very different world now. And when supply creates demand, it's possible to change somewhat costlessly. Then, if there's a book with something mean about me out, I'm going to have a hard time getting it banned. I might collect damages if it's legally actionable, but I'm not going to get people to go into libraries and yank the book under legal authority. But it is possible now, potentially, to seek a court order or other process. Maybe it doesn't mean a court order. Maybe it just needs a threatening letter on letterhead to the relevant custodian, which could include Amazon for Kindle or something, and say, this paragraph on this page is defamatory. We'll give you 30 days to quietly excise it and push out an update to that book to everybody who has it. And that represents, I think, a threat that libraries were naturally somewhat insulated from, that our current configuration is not. And it's part of the reason why when I see projects like shipping containers with books being put into them for the coming bad years, that is assuring a certain integrity. We can go back to the original source, that simply counting on that digital stuff never to flip a bit does not. I even worry about authorial-inspired updates. If I can find out from Amazon exactly on which page and which chapter of my book people put it down, maybe I should change that paragraph. And then I can start A/B testing to make my work compelling throughout. You'll just see like pictures of cats at exactly key moments where otherwise you would stop reading. And then the meaning of a book changes. It's no longer a thought at a time that rises or falls, and maybe it was very poorly received then, but don't worry, later they'll appreciate it. It becomes too responsive, too dynamic. And thinking about the role of libraries and the archive in fixing that, to me, seems quite important. So I've written an article about some of this. I can put that in the chat room too. I ended it with the thought that society can't understand itself if it can't be honest with itself. And it can't be honest with itself if it can only live in the present moment. And at exactly the time that the technology allows us to be in the present and to constantly be updating and evolving and fixing and growing, there's something to be said for that snapshot in the public interest that represents breadcrumbs that shows us where we've been and gives us a sense of narrative and trajectory rather than just a state at a moment that leaves us unanchored. So I thank you, Brewster and Catherine, and it's so great to see the various names in the chat room as kind of a justice league of people who've been working on this stuff. Nicole and Molly and Derek and Andrew and Mark and Jenny and Kat. I'm sure I'm leaving people out, but it would be great to see what this league could do for the next chapter. Thank you.
You're here.
Molly's said searches for the standing ovation button, so we're all doing that. I just when you said about bravery, Jonathan, I also thought about courage and this phrase that keeps coming back to me, that leadership in this, or leadership as a whole, is living dangerously. And I think what you describe about being challenged, just doing it, getting on with things, and but in the public interest is just so important. I'm just looking for some things in the chat, but until we get some questions coming through, and we do have this wonderful half hour ahead of us, I just wondered a little bit about maybe teasing out again about ownership. I mean, Brewster, you've talked a lot about where ownership is going and heading, and I know you're doing a lot of work as well, an interest in library futures too. I think this also ties in with some of what we're talking about just now, and I wondered if you wanted an opportunity to say something on that too.
Yes, the idea of digital ownership is a really interesting one to think about. If I were to sort of suggest, just take the phrase digital ownership and take a shower with it, take a drive with it, take a conversation with your friends. Like, what does it mean to own something in the digital world? There are many that will say there is no such thing, that everything comes with a terms of service, a license agreement that you have indicated you have. You may not know about it, but it is binding what it is you can do and not do with a digital object. Where it was pretty clear what it meant to own a book, right? You didn't have the right to go and make lots of copies of it. You had one, but you could go and own it. You could preserve it. You could, take it apart. You could lend it to somebody. You could sell it. But what does it mean to own an ebook? Do you own that ebook? And anything actually digital? And there are trade associations that say basically there is no such thing. And if we give up this concept of rule of law and go to rule of contract, all sorts of things can go very, very wrong. So there's all of the things that Jonathan was mentioning about being able to, after the fact, go and erase things, change things.
Yeah.
That is a problem. If you need a license to read, just think about that. A license to read a book. You have to get the permission that you're allowed to read that page of that book. And after you read that, they can take that page away from you and you can't actually read it again. You can't actually have a copy of it. So you say, well, really just what they want is money. It's like, no, it's control. And we're dealing with publishers that have, and academic publishers that have said, you cannot have on your digital bookshelf an old edition of that book. We will not allow it. And that is not right. And they're now actually publishers saying libraries cannot license their books. So all of the people that are library patrons are suddenly excluded. There's a line that goes and says, those people, I'm sorry, you're not allowed to read. You don't have a license to read this book. Anyway, digital ownership, the licensing culture, I think it's something that we've got to really grapple with. And you say, well, there's Creative Commons licenses. Are those the same? And I would say, actually, in some sense, they are. All right, they are. They say what it is you're allowed to do and not do. They're a rule of license, not a rule of law. Now, they are some rights reserved, as Larry Lessig classically put it. But I think we want to make it so we buy things again. That's the way we have a game with many winners. We can have lots of publishers, lots of booksellers. And you can't just go and plow them every player. You can do only limited things with them, but they're owned.
there's a really good bit in the chat that's going on with which Molly is saying, consider also the opposite problem. When authors assign the rights to publishers, they may no longer have the right to revisit their own work. That is, to publish a revised edition that reflects their new thinking. And Jonathan, you've given a great shout out for the Authors Alliance. I'm sure Molly will be very, very pleased about that too. But it is striking, isn't it, about how where we are today, and the threat to access to knowledge that we're all interested in and we're all facing. I don't know, Jonathan, your Atlantic article is exceptional, and I think it just touches on so many aspects of that kind of knowledge access, of us being able to access things that maybe we just take for granted. And in the future, you know, we want to still have access to knowledge, but it's under so much threat. What do you say to some of those things that you have addressed in that Atlantic article, Jonathan?
Well, I think in some ways it gets to the conversation we were just having around ownership.
Yeah.
To appreciate those things, ownership, licenses, contracts, they are means to an end. And if we don't have the end front of mind, we can kind of get lost in the weeds on it all. Why is it that we're establishing ownership for some stuff? We don't have yet ownership for the air that we breathe. We might have ownership for something that's rivalrous. I found myself actually working on an article about non-fungible tokens. Understand
appreciate it.
all of that, and what is the deal? And it was the thing that made it helpful for me to try to understand them and to understand the puzzles we're talking about now is just to try to have in mind a vision of the world we're trying to call into being or to maintain. Not even just like, here's a bunch of problems, how do we solve them? Because there's plenty of those. But just describe the world that we want, and how much do we agree upon that? And how much are even people who might not agree with us on the means? There's authors organizations that aren't fond of Authors Alliance, and it's all right, well, let's hear what they're thinking about. What is it? But being able to come up with that vision, and you hear pieces of that in this session right now, whether in the chat room or among us, to include a vision that you shouldn't have to have a license to read something. Things should generally be freely available. Well, I could say yes, and there should be some model by which people who write stuff get paid for it. Like that,
yeah.
That's controversial to say that. And there have been ways in which those have been reconciled before, and there are ways in which those should be reconciled again. And if they can't be reconciled through private ordering, there may be some need for law rather than contract to uphold the values in question. But without that, I worry we get lost just fighting individual battles. And that's why, speaking as somebody involved with the library, thinking about what the larger role of libraries can be, being a place of resort for people who aren't in a position to pay $30 for that Elsevier,
that's right,
or aren't in a position to know if something important has changed. Like that's what we need to be aiming for.
Role of libraries, I think, is a good way of trying to think about what we want. Writ large. I think the view of the internet as a grand library, it's more than just that. But I think that let's make sure that we actually hit that one. And libraries are well funded. In the United States, they're over $12 billion a year, and about $3 or $4 billion goes to publishers' products. And it actually funds about 20% of the trade book publishing arena. This is an enormous social project to go and support authors and publishers. Now, how much money makes it back from a publisher to an author is not to the buyer of the book's negotiation. So there are legitimate complaints, I would say, by authors about sort of the publisher contracts. But there's a lot of money that goes back upstream, and these libraries then preserve and offer access and permanence and access in different ways than the original publishing, whether it's newspapers, after the fact, they're used differently. Books have a very, very short commercial lifetime, often measured in months, if just a year, and then they're used in a different historical context within the library framework. And so libraries and publishers have always lived together. And I've been hearing more and more publishers going and saying, I don't really see why you want digital libraries. You don't want libraries that are digital libraries. You just want libraries that basically license materials and are customer service departments for database products that come from ever larger and fewer corporate conglomerates. So I think we've got an opportunity here that spans, it's not just techlash or it's just big company, griping. It's let's make games with many winners. Let's make it so that authors can get paid. There's lots of publishers. There are lots of booksellers. Imagine that, lots of booksellers. And then lots of readers, well, everyone a reader, and have a system where there's a low barrier to entry to go and become a participant in many of these different ways. And I think that just requires a very simple transaction system. If you have a too complicated transaction system like we had before Creative Commons came around, when people wanted to go and upload things to the archive, you had to go and write a contract and negotiate it with the Internet Archive. It was too hard. When the Creative Commons licenses came out, we just said, pick a license and you can put on the Internet Archive. We've got the funding, public funding, donor funding to go and support those creative works forever. And that simplified things a great deal. I think if we just understood what digital ownership meant, that would help us in the copyrighted materials. The Creative Commons materials are the gold standard, right? It's clear what it is you're allowed to do for free with these materials. And that Wikipedia adopted first the GNU model and then CC, fantastic. That libraries started putting their card catalogs into Creative Commons 0 licenses, fantastic. And that more and more academic publishers are finding that open access is the way to go. Again, great. But that doesn't solve the default situation that we have now in the United States since 1976, damn it, is everything expressed is copyrighted, and oh, by the way, it's forever. So we have to have some mechanism to go and deal with this whole spectrum. Let's get more things Creative Commons licensed, awesome. But for things that are under the default, let's go and make sure we have a way of understanding how we deal with the digital items that we come across and what ownership means in those realms.
So Wendy's put something in the chat saying, trying to paraphrase Jonathan, can we just describe the vision of the future we want, not even solving problems, a vision that you shouldn't need a license to read something? Can libraries be a place for people who can't pay to get the information they want? So thanks, Wendy, for paraphrasing up there, and we've also had a bit of a discussion about open education resources, and thanks to Kahle for that. But Jonathan, do you have something else to add to what Brewster's just described?
No, I'm delighted to hear other thoughts and questions from folks.
Cool. And then really about accessibility. I mean, we've talked about places and spaces, we've talked about libraries, you've talked, Jonathan, about custodians. If we could kind of think 20 years ahead, and both of you have predicted some of the things that we're experiencing just now and talked about that for some time, what would be, and I think that's what Wendy's getting at, what does good look like for both of you? What would be the ideal situation we would be in 20 years' time if we can succeed in the way and have that view and vision of the world that we want to see?
I'm going to play a little historical role here. Okay, the bad old days actually had some good aspects to it. Let's bring some of those back. Let's make publishers really focused on the next thing that comes out and trying to get paid for that, and have libraries and archives as distinct institutions that are differently motivated from the publishers. Go and keep copies of those and keep them accessible. So how is but isn't that the web? The web works. It's like, no, not at all. That if you have a website, it's on one place. And if that place changes, it's changed forever for everybody. Unless somebody like the Internet Archive is put in the Wayback Machine, or it's in PermaCC, or some of the other archives that sort of try to fill in the gaps. So we basically have publishing where it's only in one place. In the old days, you publish a book, It's in hundreds of places. And if one place burns down, then, or your souffle crashes, then as Jonathan said, then you kind of try to rebuild from the others. So can we go and have things live in multiple places? And the decentralized web has some of those nice characteristics to it. Let's also make it so that it's easy to make money by publishing on the net. How do you make it so that you can go and make works available and people can put a coin, drop a coin without it all having to go through some centralized place to go and make it available? And since we don't have that yet, we have things like iTunes or these collapsing into these platforms that are the only ways that you can go and make money by publishing on the net. So we need to go and solve that. And some of the crypto things are really trying to solve some of that transactional make it so that there's no friction there, so that you don't have to go and sign up with a platform to go and get your materials out there. Those are a couple aspects of how do we have a game with many winners. So how do you make it so that lots of people can participate, they feel that there's privacy is protected, that they can go and make things available to their friends, that they can go and sell things, they can go and live in an open society ruled by law, not based on contract, where they're not just big behemoth organizations and publishing systems that are sort of controlling it all.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Brewster. Again, there's some chat that's going on. One question from Ben from Flickr. Do you think there's a commercial avenue to affect change, or is this digital ownership change going to require regulatory involvement? What do you think about regulation in this space?
Yeah, before cutting to Ben's question, I was just going to try to take a crack at the 20 years out question.
Cool, go for it.
I've been rereading some of Neil Postman, who I think is somewhat a lineal descendant, intellectually speaking, of Marshall McLuhan, who's a kind of difficult read. But Neil was writing sort of these wake-up call pieces in the 1990s, really around what he saw as the rise of cable television and cable news, and what he thought cable and television was doing not to our culture in some kind of liberal versus conservative way, but to our culture and our way of learning and processing the world, each of us, back to instantaneous snapshot versus narrative. And I think the world we have now really was germinated in that cable TV era of TikToks and Snapchats, and there's reasons to like the ephemerality of some things. This isn't like everything must be on a permanent record. But if to understand the world around us, we don't have the tools to build and sustain and revise over time a narrative, then we can't have depth about how we experience the world. And that then makes us in a position to just, it's so interesting. I think of like Twitter and Facebook feeds as search engines with auto-suggest where you don't type anything. It's like coming down to derivatively nothing instead of just typing A. And it's like, aardvark? Do you want an aardvark? Right? What are you looking for? It's like, you're not typing anything. And it's like, here's some stuff. And there's even like, what's that funny tweet about Twitter, which is like, every day on Twitter, there's like somebody who becomes the subject of Twitter, and the game is not to be that person. There is this sense of, what's the outrage of the moment? And you see it and you're outraged. I mean, it really pushes buttons that are pretty deeply embedded, it seems, in ourselves. But that doesn't lead to a humanistic response to the world. And one, again, that tries to capture it with some nuance that again, allows a story to form and allows that story to have complications and wrinkles rather than just surmisable in a tweet. So all of that is to say, 20 years from now, what would the engines of cognition and the tools of cognition and recognition, which are texts in the kind of graduate English sense of it doesn't just have to be the written word, that we use to make sense of the world, and that we can pin them down enough like a paramecium on a slide that we can study it before it changes again. If it's always morphing, you're just never keeping up with it, nor are you having a common enough experience with anybody else to be able to compare notes. And when I think of like the best of academia, it really is. We have texts. It's like, oh yeah, Postman. I've read them too. And then we can argue about Postman, which isn't really saying that Postman or Kant or, name any particular text. It's not even that it's particularly magical. It's that it's an agreed upon starting point to have a conversation that can build over time. Working backwards from that then, this is now getting to Ben's question, it should be part of the vision of a society expressed in its laws, particularly laws that create markets. There's not going to be a natural market in intellectual property unless the law builds it, because it's too easy to just tell somebody what you heard. Are you violating some innate rule, or can you be prevented? Law is already all over this. There's no natural market. To be able to say, well, what should that look like to advance the causes that we think we're trying to advance? That's the world I want to see in 20 years. And it's one that involves law. And maybe in this new Gilded Age, it's a world that involves somebody with whatever motivation. I can't peer inside Andrew Carnegie's head, but somebody that can say, I'm worth $150 billion. I'll give $5 billion to this. And they'll have earned it back in a year. That can be transformative. And again, I'm not approving of the societal configuration in which that's how change happens. That's how change can happen. And I'd love to see that.
So, gosh, thank you, Jonathan. That's what a wonderful vision. Yes, you're absolutely right. As the Internet Archive is turning 25 years old, and Creative Commons is also hitting these milestones, we're always thinking okay, what's the next 25 years? And what are the guiding principles? And the Internet Archive strove originally to build a digital library. I would say, first approximation, check. Right, okay, we've got some more to go. Yeah, the institutions aren't going along all as well as the other, but okay. So what do we want this library to do for people? And I don't know. I've been working on this and really could use some help. I would say fighting misinformation, right? To the extent of let's go and put up shields against sort of crap propaganda that's put across by large corporations, large governments, large, whatever it is that it's really trying to go and make you think something that's not right. But another would be to try to increase global intelligence. Right? How do we make ourselves a smarter people? As we can start with really simple things, as we're taught in high school, at least in the United States, to think critically. You need to be able to quote, compare, and contrast. That's your fundamental, sort of piece, is you have to be able to quote something, and then you take it in its context, but you go and say, have it, and then be able to compare and contrast, and go and understand it outside of the way it was dribbled on, like cable just dribbles on. And so we've tried to make it so that you can go and you can quote anything, television, social media threads, whatever, so that you can go and hold on. If you can't hold on to it, then you can't put it in that other part of the brain. If it's just going to flow over, then we're doomed. So there's got to be mechanisms of quoting if we're going to increase the global intelligence. And I think I never thought would be the real first order of business was to try to fight propaganda coming from very powerful players.
Certainly would be interesting to have a proof of work kind of indicia around the disembodied objects that float around at the ends of links, so you have some sensibility of what it took to produce it. Because as smart as we are, so much of what we'll rely on to make decisions about the world and make an assessment of what's true is relying on other people's work. You're going to be arguing about vaccines with somebody, unless you're really taking a moment, as maybe some of us have very poorly made decisions to try to do, you're not going to be an epidemiologist. And that gets back to, well, do you trust epidemiologists? But getting a sense of what went into the information sandwich you're eating, how long it took to throw it together. That's what I mean by proof of work. What kinds of ingredients are in it, and with what aim it was produced. All of that seems, it's kind of what Brewster maybe is getting at, helpful in making sense of stuff rather than just having Borgesian streams of words appear in front of us, and you can, with a decent enough search, be presented with any words you want to affirm what you already believed.
Mm-hmm. Brewster's put context in there. Thanks.
Yeah, I Bill Dunn, who coined the term metadata, which I think is kind of interesting that somebody came up with that term. And it's Bill Dunn. He said that the metadata is more important than the data itself. This is the guy that was in charge of the electronic side of Dow Jones, right? So this was all the writers and, of all Dow Jones, Wall Street Journal. He said the metadata is more important. And I'd say in the context, which is that's another form of context, that the answer to bad speech is more context. The idea of we're going to go and snuff bad speech and knock it off the net and demand it from Apple or Facebook to go and take all bad speech off the net, it's like, what? I think that's not an easy task, and it's not what those guys signed up for. But the answer to bad speech is more context, and help people, those that are looking to help understand what's going on. And some of us just want to be entertained with info babble, but we actually don't want to know when we're being lied to, or what was behind that. I think that's a role that libraries play and can play that are outside of the publisher's interests. The publisher, whether it's a blogger or whatever, just want their idea across. How do we go and add in all of the context around it? That, I think, is a good challenge for a web 4.0. Right? So a web that's informative, that's part of a interlocked network of information that helps you understand what it is you're looking at. So you don't have to just trust in, it's in Wikipedia, it's got to be true. Actually turns out to be mostly true. But there's some way of going and following up and understanding why that assertion was there. And you can dive in and you can argue it back upstream. That's what made science such a productive mechanism of discovery and building of knowledge. What do we do now on the internet that's similar to that sort of enlightenment idea of building the corpus of knowledge?
Yeah. Well, we are now on the hour, and I think someone's put in the chat that we could have gone on for hours and hours, because you both are just such great speakers and wonderful inspirers. And so I just want to say thank you to both of you for your time this evening. You have both been, given us a lot of food for thought, but also just, as I say, have been so inspiring. And I hope you'll both come back to future summits to see if we're on track for that world that we want to see in 20 years' time. But huge thank you to both of you. And please, in the chat, could you say thank you to Brewster and Jonathan for their time this evening, and we will keep in touch. So thank you so much.
And thank you, Catherine. And keep up the great work at Creative Commons. It's so important.
It's a team effort. We will. We're next 20 years, just watch this space. Thanks to both of you, and see you all soon. Thank you. Bye.